Really? I'm going to set these down here. My name is Taylor Scott, and I'm on staff with the Navigators at KU. Just couldn't guess that. I'm originally from Wichita, and I know, shout out, what's up? I went to North High, to Redskin. Interesting fact, they almost changed their mascot to the Rainbows. They thought the Redskins would be offensive. I'm glad they didn't, because I'm glad I'm not a rainbow. So, I am currently with my wife 18 days from our 1-year anniversary. That's a cute. We met through Naz. Our first meaningful conversation was at the Glen, which is the Nav headquarters, which is strangely fitting because we're both on staff now. But Naz is going to go to the Glen first next year, so everybody else out there. So I'm really excited to talk about this. When we were planning for our talks this year, I kind of jumped at this one, and there, I admit, have been moments where I wish I didn't, but it has been so encouraging and enriching for my own soul. And I just think of that song that we just sang, in the line, 10,000 reasons for my heart to find, to bless the Lord. And as I was thinking about that, I hope that tonight adds a couple more reasons for you, as reasons why to bless the Lord and why we trust Him, why we trust the Scripture. So, it doesn't mean Scripture's hungry, for those of you that think it's voracious. It's because that's with an O. So, it's not the same. But veracity, as you see, it just means conformity to fact, or it's truthful, basically that we can trust it. It's accurate, we know what's going on. So that's, the reason that this is important for Christians is that Christianity is really different than any other religion because it's based not on doctrine or on moral laws so much as it is on historical events. Really, the hinge point of Christianity is on historic things that actually happened, because if they didn't actually happen, or if we don't know them to be true, then there's really nothing else can come after that, because we've cut it out at the base. And so that's why I think this is really important for us to believe in Scripture, to believe in Jesus, and those of you too who are considering what this is all about. This is kind of monumental in some ways. So I'm just going to pray for tonight, and then I'll dive into this incredibly deep pool. Lord, thank you for your word that is true, and most of all, God, that you speak. I just pray for tonight. I pray for myself that you wouldn't, that I would just do justice to the truth that's out there. Father, that even the evidence and things that I've seen, Father, you wouldn't let me misquote or misinterpret it. Father, you would really guard what is said tonight, and even what is heard by the people here. Father, I do pray that this would add reasons for them to bless you, Lord. Love you in Jesus' name. So, we're just going to answer a couple questions. And the first is the Bible we have an accurate copy of the original writings? Because if what we have doesn't accurately reflect what was originally written down, then again, we kind of are lost. And there's really no reason to continue trusting it. And that is really just dealing with that transmission of those words over time. And so there's a couple things that we can look at. First, we'll focus in on by Testament, because they work a little bit differently in some ways. So we'll look at the Old Testament first. Obviously, it was written much earlier than the New Testament, because you know that's why it's called the Old Testament. And the original writings, what are also called the autographs, you know where autograph came from, it's like an original writing. That's why when you sign something, it's called an autograph. Were written between 1500 and 435 BC. And there's really two texts that we have that are really important to look at when we're thinking about the Old Testament. And the first is called the Masoretic text. And it is a complete Hebrew manuscript, which is the original language. But the earliest copy we have dates to about 900 AD. So quite a while, actually, after the originals were written. But the Septuagint, if you can try to pronounce that, you can throw that at, like, your word of the day or something like that. But that's in the Greek. It's been translated into Greek, but it's still complete. But it actually dates much earlier than the earliest Hebrew copy we have, from about 200 BC. Okay? And so the question then is, well, how do we know that those are accurate, especially the Hebrew one? Because that's the original writing. If that hasn't been held all that time from when it was originally written, then we have no reason to trust that. And so some of you have probably heard of the Dead Sea Scrolls, but had no idea why they were important. I didn't probably really until I started researching this. But so the Dead Sea Scrolls really shed light on the importance of the transmission of this Old Testament. Okay, so they were found in 1946, and then over the next 10 years, these caves in a place called Qumran, which is on the west side of the Dead Sea, was excavated. And there they found over 900 scrolls of various writings. Some were the laws of that area, but about 200 of them included biblical text. And there were these four main reasons why it was really significant. All of them were in original Hebrew. So they're all written down in that area. They were never translated. It was as they were written. They included fragments of every Old Testament book except for Esther, as well as a complete copy of the book of Isaiah, which we'll talk about that significance in a second. And so because they were all in Hebrew, it pushed the date of the oldest Hebrew text from the Old Testament back 1,000 years. That's a long time. It's a really long time, especially to find something like this. So then what we had from that Masoretic text, that Isaiah passage, or the book of Isaiah, when that was checked against what the Dead Sea Scrolls found, it was identical up to 95%. And we'll look at it. The next thing is an example of what that other 5% differed in, because none of that actually changed the meaning of the text. Okay, there were kind of three things that differed in there. So for an example, we'll look at the 53rd chapter of Isaiah. Right, and there's 166 words there. Some of you math majors or whatever can be doing this better than I do. But there were 17 letters, so like individual letters, not even words, that differed. And so 10 of those were spelling differences, right? We no longer spell color with a U because we broke away from Britain. Thank the Lord. And 4 of those were stylistic changes. So like if you would be proper and write cannot versus can't, right? I don't think there's an ain't in there. I don't think that's probably bad joke. Anyway, and then the other 3 letters consisted of the word, it made the word light, right? There's one place where light, the word light was inserted, well not inserted, it appeared in the Dead Sea Scrolls and it was no longer kept in the Masoretic text, right? But that addition didn't change the meaning, and in the Septuagint and other fragments of that same section of Isaiah also found at Qumran, that word light was there. And so it's not a significant change to say we have to throw all this out. We don't know anything about the Old Testament. So the significance then of the Dead Sea Scrolls is that we know that for 1,000 years, the Old Testament has been held the same. In the original Hebrew too. It wasn't going back and forth and being translated into different languages. So that gives incredible assurance for the authenticity, for the accuracy of the Old Testament over that entire period of time. Because over that 1,000 years, you think, if you wrote something today, and then in 3012, that message hadn't changed at all. Not one bit. Maybe there was a can't instead of a cannot. Right? That'd be amazing. That's really something special. And that, yeah, it's really significant. You guys get that significant, right? Okay. So, for the New Testament, obviously it's a lot newer than the Old Testament. But that also means that we have a lot more copies, just because obviously over time things decay and they get thrown out or destroyed somehow, floods come or whatever. So we just have a lot more copies of the New Testament than we do ancient texts of the Old Testament. And actually, that number, if you want it, it's up there. There's like over 24,000 different copies of either complete or fragmented New Testaments. That's a huge number. That's crazy. Okay, 24,600, if you will. But that's far more than any other work of antiquity that there's out there. Okay, so works by like Aristotle and Plato. Some of you guys are like reading these people, right? I haven't. I'm not ashamed of that. But like, and then so Aristotle, Plato, and Caesar, all the things that they've written, there's no more than 10 copies in existence that we found. Okay, and so you compare something like that is, I mean, rarely ever questioned. There was textual criticism done on those things to make sure that they were authentic, but nowhere near the skepticism that there is towards the New Testament. So if we line those things up and say, well, look at the difference between how many texts we have of this New Testament versus some of these people like Aristotle and Plato, that we don't really even question the authenticity of these texts, right? That's just a staggering number. There's a scholar, John Warwick Montgomery, very proper name. There's this quote by him that I think helps put this into perspective. It says, "To be skeptical of the resultant text of the New Testament books is to allow all of classical antiquity to slip into obscurity. For no documents of the ancient period are as well attested biographically as the New Testament." There's nothing else out there from this time period, or even earlier than this, that has as much backing it as the New Testament does. And that's incredible. Another key part of the New Testament, because it was so recently written, and especially because it was so recently written after the actual events occurred, the earliest manuscripts that we have are like right next to when things actually happened and when the originals were made. Okay, so if we look at an example, this next little section here, we see that, so there's a couple of, comparisons right there. So something written by Caesar, right, written in 100 to 44 BC. The earliest copy of his writings that we have is from 900 AD, which is 1,000 years later. It's a long time. We talked about that already, right? And even then, there's only 10 copies of that. Homer's Iliad has a lot more copies, but there's still a 500-year time span between when he actually wrote this epic poem to when the earliest copy that we have was from, right? And so that just makes judging its authenticity a lot harder, because you have so much more room where things could have changed. However, with the New Testament being written between 40 and 100 AD, and then our earliest fragment is actually from John, a little section from John 18, and it comes from the year 125, right? So this is between 25 and 50 years since it was actually written. Okay, that's incredibly significant, because over those 25, 50 years, which is less than a generation, you have people that are still around that were actually at the events he's writing about. Okay, so I was thinking about something that we could compare this to, just to like try to wrap our minds around this. And so there's kind of an event in KU history that happened in 2008. And I mean, I don't know if you guys know what I'm talking about. Was anybody at something big that happened that year? There's a couple of people. So the national championship, when KU took the title. I know, really big deal, right? Does anybody remember? So there's a lot of people that weren't there. Do any of you guys know who shot like the game, not winning, but the big deal basket? How do you guys know that if you were not there? So there's a lot like TV, media, like my phone, it's beamed in my brain, like I heard somebody screaming it from rooftops, all these things. Okay, here, I'm gonna test you on this one. Does anybody know how much time was left when he shot that? do you think that some of you guys have smartphones and could probably like find that out right now? Like, you don't have to, but you probably could. And like in every picture of him like going up for it, you can see this. You can see the time on the backboard, right? I mean, I didn't look it up. My guess was 3.1. Okay, we're all in the threes though, right? So we were either there, we have access to things or people even that were there. Okay, that's the importance of this text being so close to when these actual events occurred, or even the people that were there being able to attest to their authenticity, right? Just like if somebody like came up and was like, "Hey, you didn't win," you know, what? Where were you living? Like, it's not right. I have proof. So that's the significance of that. If that helps you wrap your mind around it. Okay, and so I hope that you get from that, and really from a lot of this stuff, is not to like beef yourself up and be like, you know how many manuscripts are in the New Testament? But what I do hope that leads you to is that if you hear people saying like, the Bible is, why are you trusting that? It has changed so much. We even have like what was really written, things like that. I'm not saying that they don't have their reasons for believing that, but I'm saying I hope that you will come out with some reasons for challenging them, and that you would at least ask them some questions to challenge what they're saying. Okay? So if we have now what was written then, the next question is, well, what was written then accurate? Did it really describe the events that were occurring, or were these people just making stuff up? Right? And so there's really kind of three things that we could look at with that. Eyewitness accounts, historical significance, and we'll get into all that. But first we'll start with the eyewitness accounts. And this is where, again, that time span really plays in. Okay? And so this is kind of like the difference between, so Lawrence, I don't know if you guys ever read the Lawrence Journal World. This is the city's newspaper if you've never seen a copy. Have any of you guys ever bought a National Enquirer? Ever? I haven't. I always just look at it because, like, as soon as I see the front cover of it at the supermarket, I'm just like, why would anybody spend money? But the one, I still remember going through the checkout counter with my dad one time, and there's this picture of this kid on the front of the National Enquirer. He had like these like bat ears and bat wings. It was Bat Boy. If you guys have not seen Bat Boy, you need to Google this thing, because this guy he had something going on, right? But instantly you're like, that's not real. Like, there's just some like guttural thing inside of you that just screams that cannot happen, right? Like, there's no way that exists. And so the same is true. Like, that's why we have to consider is what was really written back then, was that real, or was it like a Bat Boyish type writing? Okay. So sorry, eyewitness accounts. You gotta focus. Okay. So people within Christendom, and especially looking at an apostle, Peter writes of a specific account where he's calling out some eyewitnesses. Okay, so in Acts 2, you can turn here if you want, Acts 2, 22 through 23, and then also we'll jump over to 32 and 33. There's a lot of 2s and 3s in there. I didn't do that on purpose. But I'll just read that really quick. It starts, Men of Israel, and it's up on the screen. Men of Israel, hear these words. Jesus of Nazareth, a man attested to you by God with mighty works and wonders and signs that God did through him in your midst, as you yourselves know. This Jesus, delivered up according to the definite plan and foreknowledge of God, you crucified and killed by the hands of lawless men. And then down to 32. This Jesus God raised up, and of that we are all witnesses. Being therefore exalted at the right hand of God, and having received from the Father the promise of the Holy Spirit, he has poured out this that you yourselves are seeing and hearing. So there's like some very clear language there that Peter is saying, you guys were there, you saw this, you killed him, and you're seeing what's happening now as a result. Okay, so if somebody came up to me and was like, you straight up murdered this guy, I'd be like, no way, I did not do that. But these guys had no way. they were confronted with what really happened. And they knew it because they were there and saw it. Okay, and they don't end up like throwing all of these lashbacks at him. They say, you're right. Oh my gosh, we did that. And so they have nothing to say but affirming what is being said. And so, especially in a situation like this, where Peter is calling out people that are opposing him and mocking him, of course, they of all people would be the ones to say, you're wrong. This is not right what you're saying. That's not what we saw. That's not the same story. And so I think that's really significant. I use that word a lot, but it is. To consider that even the people that were opposing what was being said, when they're confronted with it and said, you've seen this too, they have no choice but to say you're right. And so outside of the circle of Christendom, it's kind of like third party, there's this guy named Flavius Josephus. And I tried with all my might, I assure you, to put a grill and a big clock on that guy's picture right there. But I do not have the technical abilities to do that, because with the name, his name is Flavius, okay? And I was like, I cannot pass this up, but I just couldn't make it work, okay? So if somebody wants to do that and like send it to me, I would be forever grateful. I'll buy a candy bar or something like that. Because, dude, that guy's rocking. Okay, but he was a Jewish historian. He wasn't a Christian. But he writes this, okay? He says, and there arose about this time Jesus, a wise man, if indeed we should call him a man. For he was a doer of marvelous deeds, a teacher of men, who received the truth with pleasure. He led away many Jews and also many of the Greeks. This man was the Christ. And when Pilate had condemned him to the cross on his impeachment by the chief men among us, those who had loved him at the first did not cease, for he appeared to them on the third day alive again. The divine prophets have spoken these and thousands of other wonderful things about him. And even now the tribe of Christians, so named after him, has not yet died out. I know it's a little different than that one. I found what I believe to be a more accurate translation of that text right there, so that's what I was reading. But that brings up a good point, because I've heard a lot of people bring criticism to especially this passage and say it's used out of context, it's not actually what he wrote. And the fact that he was a Jew and not a Christian means that he would be he would oppose the Christians at that time too. And so there's a woman, Amy R. Ewing, and she wrote the Bible, Is the Bible Intolerant? Is the name of the book that she wrote. And she kind of explains it this way. Well, she said that early copies of his writing have this paragraph in there. And that that means that, that if that was pulled into question, then all of his earlier work would be questioned as well. And he's written so much about early Jewish history that would not be good for a lot of people. But she goes on to say this. She says, scholars also argue that Josephus is speaking in jest and is mocking those who believe in Jesus, and that the overall tone of his passage is heavy with irony and scorn. And if this is the case, it is a useful historical document which mentions the bare facts of Christian belief about Jesus, the historical person, and as such deserves our attention. So even if he didn't believe this, he's still recording historically what Christians of that day did believe about who Jesus was. Okay, so I do think that is significant, and wanted to present both of those sides to where you can kind of think about it as you will. Okay. So again, just to reiterate, the eyewitness accounts are hugely important, especially for the New Testament, because the time span between when they were originally written and what we have is so small. Okay. Secondly, there's a great historical importance in this passage of Matthew 28, 1 through 10. And this is really significant because at that time, this is really dealing with like the credibility of the witnesses, or the people that were writing. And this is significant because at this time in history, the testimony of women was not highly regarded. It couldn't be used in court, and it was really low ranking in society. And actually, in the what's called the Talmud, which is a collection of basically commentaries from rabbis that kind of governed law and philosophy, and they just spoke on all sorts of different things. But it was held, this Talmud was held almost as high as in authority as Scripture, as the Old Testament Scripture at this time. And so there's two quotes from this time that say, first it says, any evidence which a woman gives is not valid to offer. This is equivalent to saying that one who is rabbinically accounted a robber is qualified to give the same evidence as a woman. Basically, if you're a robber or a thief, you hold the same standing or legitimacy in court as a woman does. And it also says, sooner let the words of the law be burnt than delivered to a woman. I mean, I'm really struck by this. Like, it's really harsh, obviously, but I think that paints an accurate picture of the time period and the testimony of women in this time period. But that should make us think even more about things that Jesus does and says, and especially this passage, which I'll just read the beginning of. And it says, now after the Sabbath, this is after Jesus' crucifixion and burial. It says, now after the Sabbath, toward the dawn of the first day of the week, Mary Magdalene and the other Mary went to see the tomb. And behold, there was a great earthquake, for an angel of the Lord descended from heaven and came and rolled back the stone and sat on it. And I'll jump down to 7. It says, then go quickly and tell his disciples that he is risen from the dead. And behold, he is going before you to Galilee. There you will see him. See, I have told you. So they departed quickly from the tomb with fear and great joy and ran to tell his disciples. So thinking about what this Talmud said about the significance or the authority given to women in their testimony, this should not be written there. If this was made up, it had no purpose being there, because they're in a sense discrediting themselves by saying that women were the first people to see the empty tomb and the risen Jesus, unless it was true. If it was true, that'd be the only reason for them to write it this way, would be to actually give an accurate account of what was happening here, because it was so opposite, so unexpected for that time, that this is the way that it would happen. And this is just monumental, really. Okay, so thirdly, is looking at just the life of the apostles, right? The apostles, 12, are not glamorous guys, do not have extravagant lives. Thinking of Andrew, Peter, James, and John, they're all fishermen, which was not like, all right, I want to be a fisherman when I grow up kind of thing, you know? It's like they were not going to school, they weren't following a rabbi. I guess I'll fish. Right? It's kind of the last thing you can do. Nathan, or Bartholomew, he insults Jesus' hometown. All the disciples kind of bicker and argue for honor and all of that stuff. Peter denies Jesus, and he loses faith when he's out on out of the boat in the storm. And then after Jesus' death, all the disciples just kind of like scatter and hide behind locked doors because they're afraid of persecution. Right? So they're not painted as like especially like courageous and like fearless or faithful guys. They're just real people. So I think that attests to, like, if they were writing this, I mean, if I was writing it, I'd probably put myself in the best light possible, pick out all the really good things that have happened in my life, where I really like excelled, you know, not about the time where my first soccer practice I left crying because I didn't know what was happening. I didn't know what offense and defense were. Nobody explained it to me, so I didn't get a uniform to go back. So if I'm not over that, there's deeper problems. Okay, so not only were their lives not glamorous, but the end of their lives were especially not glamorous. All of these guys endured horrible deaths, except for one that it was much better. So on the next part, the apostles. So I'll let you guys read through that. We don't need to like go into the details of all that means. But everybody except for John was martyred. John, they tried to boil him in oil, but he didn't die, and so they just kicked him out and put him on a little island to work in mines. So I guess it got out of easy. The thing is, people don't die for things they don't believe, or especially for things that aren't true. And so if what they were following what they were preaching, what they were telling other people about, especially who Jesus was and what he had done, if none of that was true, or to the extent that they were saying it to be true, I don't think that would happen. You know, maybe one or two of those guys would have taken it all the way and just like tried to, you know, persevere to make his life to be remembered or whatever. But that many people don't die for something that they don't believe is true. And I think that's a real powerful testimony to what these guys believed in the message that they were carrying, and that this Bible testifies to. Okay, so kind of lastly, we looked at, you know, has it been faithful throughout this time? Was it faithful in the beginning of real life events? And then just kind of lastly, thinking about other sources, what like archaeological data or scientific things have been found to help us understand this a little better. And I will say that I'm not going to go real in depth, especially with archaeological stuff. If you guys haven't noticed, we're doing a Bible study this year called Truths for Life. You can get it off a website, kingofnaz.org. There's actually an appendix at the end of that has a whole section about why we can trust the Scripture. And in there, it lists way more stuff about archaeological finds and even scientific data that I could convey or that you would be comfortable sitting through tonight. So I would encourage you to look at that. And I actually have a handout in the back I would encourage you to pick up too. It kind of a summary of all of these notes, as well as some books for a resource in the end, and kind of where you can find that stuff in the Bible study too. So that will be on the back corner, just right out the table. I'd really encourage you to grab one of those. But just real briefly for archaeological, historical kind of stuff, there's been over like 25,000 different digs and stuff that have been going on, and not one of those has disproved like a location or event, things like that in the Bible. Okay, and just as an example of that, there are these two things. One's called the black stele, and one's called the Ebla tablet. And they're both pre-Mosaic, so before Moses. And actually, the black stele is even before Abraham. So this is like thousands of years ago. Okay, because there's people out there that said there's no way that Moses even wrote any of the Old Testament because he didn't even have writing when he was alive. Like, how old is that? You don't know how to, like, there is no written language. Basically, that's really a long time ago. Okay, but both of these are predating at least Moses by 1,000 years. The black stele predates Abraham. Okay, and they both have writing on them. I don't know if it's cursive or script or what, but somebody in the world now can read those and knows what they say, and it's legitimate writing. Okay, so that's just one example of all the myriad of things that you could dive into and learn about this stuff, but I won't go into it. The other thing that I just think is really interesting and in some ways really helpful, this is one of the most encouraging things that I looked at, and that was looking at probability and the prophecies, specifically dealing with Jesus. Okay, so Jesus claims to be the Messiah, and there's a lot of prophecies in the Old Testament about the Messiah. So this guy, Peter Stoner, he wrote a book called Science Speaks. Guess what? It's at the Spencer Library. You can check it out and read it. Okay, I actually even put the call number for it on the handout, so you could like go after this if it's open and find it, if you want. But in case you don't, here's a couple things that he says. Okay, so there's like over and all these prophecies, by the way, are actually in that Bible study appendix. So look at them because it has like where the prophecy is and then where it's fulfilled. That's really cool. You could do like a whole year's study just off of looking at those things. Okay. So there's like 61 prophecies about the Messiah. 32 of those you can see fulfilled in the life of Jesus. The other 29 you see fulfilled in a 24-hour time period that includes his betrayal, death, trial, death, and burial. That's crazy, right? And of those 29, they were all written between the time period of 1000 to 500 BC. Which is, if you don't know, is a long time before Jesus was written. Like a really long time. Okay, and they were all fulfilled in that last little bit of his life. And even thinking about things that he could not control. like how he was killed. Okay, so Stoner, he brings this kind of like into perspective this way, and I'm sure some of you guys have probably heard this, but he looks at just one person in that time period fulfilling 8 of those prophecies. Just 8. That's an 8-ish. This is 61 of the total about Jesus. Okay, so for one person to fulfill 8 of those at that time period would be the chance of 1 in 10 to the 17th power. And because we're also familiar with what that number looks like, there it is. Okay, that statistic would be like taking silver dollars or half dollars and that number of them, 10 to the 17th, and laying them over the state of Texas, which would cover the entire state 2 feet deep. Who here is from Texas? Is that, I mean, Texas is pretty big, right? It's like, right, yeah, I mean, Alaska's huge, but everything is bigger than Texas, okay? Even prophecies being fulfilled. So, 2 feet deep, all of Texas, you pick one coin, and like mark it with an X, or somehow, right? Put a little smiley face, and put it back in there, and then stir everything up, all over the state, everywhere, everything, thoroughly. And then take one person, one of you could do this if you wanted, blindfold yourself and walk as much as you want around the entire state and pick up one coin. Okay, that's for 8 prophecies. There's 61. Okay, so to put this into better perspective, if that doesn't help, so if we doubled that and we did 16 prophecies, okay, this is a quarter-ish of the total. That's a big number. That's 10 with 45 zeros behind it. Took me a long time to type. If you still use the half dollars, okay, it wouldn't cover a state. You would have to put them into a ball, all right, and if you place them where the Earth is, it would expand 30 times the distance between where the Earth and the Sun is. Okay, so get one, and mark it with an X or a smiley face, toss it back in, stir everything, blindfold a guy, poor soul, send him out. He can walk and dig and go wherever he wants, but he just gets to pick one. Okay? That's to fulfill a quarter of the prophecies that Jesus is recorded to have fulfilled. One guy. That's crazy. And he goes on to like the next number, and I lost him. I was like, because he starts using electrons because it's so big and the quarter thing is like not substantial enough. I'm just like, I don't know. Okay, I believe you. Okay, so don't think, wow, man, God lucked out with Jesus. Like this guy, he's a winner. Like, good thing he came along because I don't think we would have found the quarter, kind of thing, you know. What we should think, okay, is that all of Scripture has the same author, and he knows the beginning from the end from the beginning, and probably the other way around too, but still, okay. Statistically, that's what we're basically saying. It would be impossible. That's what all of those boil down to. It's just more and more impossible. But it did happen. So, the end question, there's actually one more end question after this, is what the Bible claims and what it's saying relevant? Sure, it's true, okay, I believe it. You know, maybe you do, maybe you still have doubts. That's okay. You know, I would not expect you at the end of this. I'm just a guy who did a little bit of research and like is talking about quarters and stuff like that. But if you're like, okay, yeah, that helps. Like, you know, I think this really is true. Like it's saying what it's supposed to.